The woman stood barefoot in the dust, still holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, without her noticing. 3 riders came down the north road. Slow. Men in a hurry never come slow. Men who come slow want you to have time to be afraid. She didn't step back. Didn't blink. The lead rider pushed his hat up and smiled. He asked where her husband was. Her husband had been in the ground a year. They called it an accident. Behind the barn the dog went wild. Chain rattling. Then nothing. From the side of the shed came the sound of a hammer being drawn back. Inside her apron pocket, a second layer of canvas had been stitched in, something no one in this town had ever thought to wonder about. 3 years. She had never once reached for it. 30 seconds, she said. The big man laughed. Her hand was already moving. The wind came first. Before the riders. Before the dust cloud on the horizon. Before anything else that morning, the wind came down off the ridge, and moved through the wheat like something alive, like something that remembered. Josephine Calloway stood at the edge of her porch, and watched it. Watched the grass bend. Watched the light change color the way it did every morning in the Wyoming territory, gold sliding into gray, gray sliding into something colder. She had a cup of coffee in her hand that had gone lukewarm an hour ago, and she hadn't noticed. Because that was the thing about mornings out here. They asked nothing of you. And she had learned, over one long and terrible year, to give them nothing back. The farmhouse behind her creaked. Old wood settling into older ground. Daniel used to say the house talked in its sleep. She used to laugh at that. Now she just listened to it, and thought about how a house could keep making sounds long, after the man, who built half its walls, had stopped making any sound at all. She was 20 years old. She looked, some mornings, like she'd lived twice that. Not in her face. Her face was still young. Smooth along the cheek. Sharp along the jaw. The kind of face that turned heads at the mercantile whether she wanted it to or not. Dark hair pulled back tight enough to mean business. Gray eyes that didn't do much flinching anymore. No. It wasn't her face. It was something underneath it. Something coiled. Something that had gone very, very quiet. The dog barked once, from the barn, a short low sound, more habit than alarm, and Josie set her coffee cup down on the porch rail, without looking at it. Old reflex. The kind you don't choose. The kind that chooses you. 3 riders were coming down the north road. She didn't reach for anything. Not yet. She just watched them come, the same way she watched everything come. Slow. Patient. Already 3 moves ahead. Coldwater Ridge, Wyoming territory. Population 400, and change, most of it opinion. They called her the widow on the north section. That was the polite version. There were less polite ones, murmured over counters at the general store, traded like currency between women, who had never once carried water from a well themselves. Poor thing. All alone out there. Somebody ought to check on her. Nobody ever did. Which suited Josie fine. Because being underestimated, she had learned, the hard way, the only way anybody really learns anything, was not a curse. It was a weapon. Maybe the only one nobody could take from her. She kept it sheathed. Kept it quiet. Kept the farm running, with her own 2 hands up before the sun, down after it, milking and mending, and hauling and hoping, some tired nights, that hoping was still a thing she was allowed to do. Amos Whitlock came by twice a week. Older man. Silver in his beard. A limp in his left leg that he never explained, and she never asked about. He'd bring flowers sometimes. Sometimes just company. He'd sit on the porch step, and not say much, and that not saying much was its own kind of conversation, the kind you only get with someone who's known you since before you knew yourself. You sleepin'? He asked her, one such evening, weeks before the riders came. Some. That ain't an answer. It's the only one I got, Amos. He nodded then. Slow. The way he nodded at everything, like the world required careful consideration before you let it in. Your daddy used to say the same thing, he said. Right before he'd tell me a lie. She hadn't answered that. Just looked out at the wheat, gold going to gray, and let the silence do what silence does out on the plains. Stretch itself thin and wide until it covers everything. Until it feels less like an absence and more like a roof. Now. The riders. 3 of them. Coming down slow, which was its own kind of message. Men in a hurry don't come slow. Men in a hurry don't want you to have time to think. These men wanted her to think. Josie stepped off the porch. Bare feet in the dust, because she hadn't had time for boots, because the coffee had gone cold in her hand, and some animal part of her brain had already done the math, before the rest of her caught up. 3 men. 1 farmhouse. No neighbors close enough to hear a raised voice. The dog again. Barking harder now, from behind the barn, chain rattling. Morning, the lead rider said, reining up maybe 20 feet out. Big man. Hat pulled low. A vest that had once been fine, and was now just faded, the way most fine things get out here eventually. This the Calloway place? It is. Fine spread. He looked around like he was pricing it. Which, she'd learn in about 4 minutes he was. Awful lot of land for one woman. I manage. I bet you do. There was a laugh in that. Small. Ugly at the edges. The kind of laugh 2 men give each other, when they think the third person in the conversation isn't really a person at all. Just a feature of the landscape. Like the wheat. Like the fence line. Something to be moved through or moved out of the way. Beside him sat a thinner man, nervous hands, the kind that kept finding reasons to touch the grip of his revolver like it was a worry stone. And a third rider hung back near the barn, saying nothing at all, young by the set of his shoulders, quiet in a way that felt less like shyness, and more like something being held very still on purpose. Josie didn't blink. Didn't move. Just waited. Because that was the other thing she'd learned, somewhere in the years she didn't talk about. The years before Coldwater Ridge. Before Daniel. Before this farm, and this porch, and this careful, deliberate, exhausting performance of ordinary. That the first man to speak, after a silence like this one usually loses something. A little leverage. A little control. She could wait longer than any of them. She'd had practice. We're here representing an interested party, the thin one said. Parties willing to make a generous offer on this land. Land's not for sale. Everything's for sale, the big one said. Question's just the price. Not this time. Silence again. The wind picked up, moved through the wheat, moved through her hair, and for one strange, suspended second the whole scene felt like something out of a dream she used to have. A long time ago. In a different life. A life where she wore a badge on her hip instead of an apron, and men like these 3 didn't smile at her. They ran from her. She pushed that thought down. Buried it. Because that life was over. Because she had promised someone, herself, the ghost of a man, who wasn't around to hear the promise, that it was over. You got a real pretty setup here, the big man said, and something shifted in his voice, some hinge swinging open, onto a room she didn't want to see inside of. Real pretty. Shame if something happened to it. Is that a threat? It's a conversation. Feels like a threat. Well. He smiled. Yellow teeth. Feelings can lie. Here is where it should be said quietly, the way all the important things in this story get said, that Josephine Calloway had not touched a firearm, with intent in 3 years. 3 years of mending fences instead of drawing on men, who deserved drawing on. 3 years of biting down on something sharp, and old and dangerous every single time a man like this rode onto her land, and smiled at her like she was furniture. 3 years. And every single one of those years had cost her something she couldn't get back. A callus grown thick over an old wound. A door nailed shut, over a room full of things she used to be very, very good at. She thought about that door now. Thought about how close these 3 men were standing to it. Thought about how the third rider, the quiet one, the one who hadn't said a word yet, was easing his horse around toward the barn. Toward something that mattered more to her than land ever could. "Where's your husband at?" the big one asked. Casual. Cruel in its casualness. Man ought to be handling this kind of business. Not leave it to his wife. "My husband's dead." "That's so." He didn't even pretend to be sorry. "Recent?" "Recent enough." "Then you understand." He leaned forward in the saddle. "A woman alone. No husband. No sons. No hands to speak of. This land's gonna get taken from you one way or another, ma'am. Question's just whether you get paid for it, or whether you get left with nothing at all." Something in Josie's chest went very cold and very still. Because she'd heard this speech before. Not these words. Not this man. But the shape of it, the particular architecture of a threat dressed up as advice. She'd heard that shape before, a long time ago, on a night she didn't let herself think about except in the smallest hours. The ones between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the whole world felt thin enough to fall through. "You've got 30 seconds, she said, "to get off my land?" The big man laughed again. Louder this time. "Or what?" "Or you'll find out." That was when the dog stopped barking. That was when the third rider, the quiet young one, came around the corner of the barn, with his revolver already drawn, already leveled, already aimed at the animal chained by the water trough, and said the only 2 words he'd say in this whole scene. Flat and bored, like he was swatting a fly. "Watch this." Everything after that happened faster than words can really hold. Which is the trouble with telling it. Because the mind, in moments like these, doesn't experience time the way it does in ordinary minutes. It doesn't experience seconds. It experiences fractures. Little broken pieces of now, stacked up so fast they blur into something almost like stillness. Josie's hand moved. Except it wasn't really her hand that moved first. It was something underneath the hand. Something that had been waiting, coiled, patient, for 3 long years of fence mending, and flower buying and pretending. Something that woke up the instant that revolver swung toward the dog, and did not ask permission from the rest of her. The apron pocket. The one nobody thought to check, because nobody thought a farm widow needed a reason to keep a pocket reinforced with an extra layer of canvas. The one that had, resting inside it every single day for 3 years, a small break-top revolver that Amos Whitlock had given her the week Daniel died, and told her, in a voice she'd never forget, just in case. Just in case. She never thought she'd need the case. Until she did. The gun cleared the pocket in a motion, so clean, so economical, so utterly without hesitation, that later, much later, when this story got told, and retold around Coldwater Ridge's stove-heated saloon on winter nights, men would swear it couldn't have happened the way it happened. Would swear a farm widow couldn't move like that. Would swear, some of them, that she must have been reaching for the weapon the whole conversation. Must have had it in her hand from the start. She hadn't. She just didn't need very long. The shot cracked across the yard, and the young rider's revolver went spinning out of his hand, before the barrel had even leveled all the way at the dog. He screamed. Grabbed his wrist. Fell back against the barn wall, with a sound like a sack of grain hitting the ground. Silence. Total, ringing silence. The big man's horse reared. The thin one's hand froze halfway to his own weapon, and stopped there, hanging in the air like it had forgotten what it was for. Josie stood in the yard, with her arms still extended. Smoke curling off the short barrel of the revolver. Bare feet planted wide in the dust. Coffee-cold morning air moving through hair that had come loose from its pins somewhere in the last 4 seconds. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The big man started. 30 seconds, Josie said. Her voice hadn't changed at all. That was the part that scared them, though none of them could have said why. Not the shot. The voice. 22 left. The thin one's hand came away from his gun like it had touched fire. You're gonna regret that, the big man said, but there wasn't much conviction left in it. His horse was still sidestepping under him, spooked by the shot, and he was having trouble making the two things, the horse and the threat, line up into something believable. 15, Josie said. Lady, you don't know who you just. 10. He looked at the young one, still crouched against the barn wall clutching a bleeding hand, and something calculated behind his eyes, some accounting, some tally of costs and outcomes, settled the matter for him faster than any threat could have. This ain't finished, he said, wheeling his horse around. It is for today. They rode. All three of them, the wounded one somehow managing to haul himself up into the saddle despite the blood running down his wrist, and they didn't look back, not once, all the way up the north road, and over the ridge and gone. Josie stood in the yard for a long moment, after the dust had settled. Her hand, the one holding the revolver, was perfectly steady. It was the rest of her that was shaking. She sat down hard on the porch step. Just sat. Let the gun rest in her lap, still warm, still smelling of powder, and put her face in her free hand and breathed. In. Out. In. Because there is a difference, a real, physical, unbridgeable difference, between the part of you that knows how to do a thing, and the part of you that has to live with having done it. The first part is trained. The second part is human. And for 3 years Josie had convinced herself, or tried to, that the second part had won. That she'd become, through sheer force of will, and grief and repetition, a person for whom that first part simply didn't exist anymore. It existed. God help her, it existed, and it had just proven it in front of 3 strangers, and a barking dog, and now she had to sit with what that meant. The dog came, and put its head in her lap. She scratched behind its ears, with a hand that still wouldn't quite stop trembling. Some secret, she said to it, quiet, almost laughing, the kind of laugh that's really just the front half of a sob. Some secret you kept. Word travels in a small town the way water travels downhill. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for the right moment. It just finds the lowest point, and pools there, and in Coldwater Ridge the lowest point, the place all the gossip eventually settled, was the counter of Pemberton's Mercantile, where old Silas Pemberton had been trading news for nails, since before most of the town was born. By noon, 3 different versions of what happened at the Calloway place had made it into town. By 2 o'clock, Sheriff Boyd Hutchins had heard all 3, and believed none of them enough to do anything about it. He rode out anyway. Because that was, technically, his job, though the way he approached it, slow, reluctant, like a man walking toward a chore he'd rather skip, suggested his heart wasn't fully behind the technicality. Hutchins was not a bad-looking man. 40-some years old, a mustache gone mostly gray, a badge he wore like it was slightly too heavy for his shirt. He'd been sheriff of Coldwater Ridge for 6 years, and in that time had developed a very particular skill. The skill of looking busy, while doing exactly what powerful men wanted him to do. He found Josie out by the fence line, mending a section the storm had knocked loose 2 weeks back. Working like nothing had happened. Working, in fact, like she was trying very hard to convince herself nothing had. Afternoon, Mrs. Calloway. Sheriff. Hearin' some stories about your morning. Are you? Man came into town, with a bullet graze on his wrist. Says a farm widow shot the gun clean out of his hand, before he could blink. Josie kept working. Didn't look up. Sounds like an exaggeration. Does it? Men like that tend to tell stories that make them look better than the truth does. Hutchins studied her for a long moment. There was something in his face, not quite suspicion, not quite belief, something caught between the two, and unable to commit to either, that made Josie's stomach tighten. Funny thing, he said. Man given that account. Nobody around here's ever seen him before. Not local. Not passin' trade either, way he was dressed. Strangers pass through all the time. They do. He shifted his weight. This one asked around town first. For he ever rode out to your place. Asked about the Calloway spread. Asked who owned it. Asked, he paused here, and something in the pause felt deliberate, felt aimed, whether the husband was really dead, or whether that was just a story you told to keep men off your land. The hammer in Josie's hand went still. That's a strange thing to ask, she said. It is. What did you tell him? Told him the truth. Told him Daniel Calloway went out plowing the east field a year back, and his horse spooked, and he went under the blade, and that was that. Terrible accident. Whole town mourned it. That's what happened. That's what the report says, Hutchins agreed, and there was something in the way he said report, some small, careful distance from the word truth, that Josie filed away, and could not, let herself examine too closely just then. Is there anything else, Sheriff? He looked at her a long moment. Looked at the mended fence. Looked, briefly, toward the barn, the water trough, the exact spot where a man's revolver had gone spinning out of his hand that morning. No, ma'am, he said finally. Reckon not. He turned his horse, and rode back toward town, and Josie stood at the fence line, and watched him go, and thought with a coldness that had nothing to do with the wind. He's lying about something. I just don't know what yet. That night she didn't sleep. Which was nothing new. Sleep had become a rumor to her, something other people did, something that used to visit her regularly, before it packed its things, and left without saying why. She sat at the kitchen table, with a single lamp burning low, and the revolver, the little break-top she'd carried in her apron for 3 years, without once needing it, laid out on the wood in front of her, disassembled, cleaned, oiled, the way her father had taught her to do it a lifetime ago. Take care of your weapon, he used to say, and it'll take care of you. Neglect it, and it'll fail you exactly, when you need it most. She hadn't thought about her father's voice in months. Now it wouldn't leave her alone. Elias Marsh. United States Marshal. A man other men spoke of the way you speak of weather systems. With respect. With a certain wariness. With the understanding that he was a force that moved through a territory and left it changed. He had taught her to shoot before she was old enough to understand what shooting really meant. Had taught her to ride before her legs were long enough to properly reach the stirrups. Had looked at his only child, a girl, in a world that had very specific and very narrow ideas about what girls were for, and decided, quietly, stubbornly, that the world's ideas were wrong. She was 13 when they killed him. The memory came the way it always came. Not gently. Not in pieces she could control. It came like a door kicked open. A ranch outside of a town, whose name she had spent years trying to forget, and never quite managed. Night. Torches. Voices raised in argument outside the house, her father's voice among them, steady even when the others weren't. And then the sound. The sound that ended one part of her life, and began another, so loud and so final that even now, 15 years later, she sometimes heard it in the wind. In a slammed door. In the crack of a whip. She had been in the loft. Hiding because he told her to hide, told her in a voice that brooked no argument even from a daughter who rarely took orders from anybody. She had watched through a gap in the boards. She had seen the man who did it. Not his face, not clearly, not in a way she could have described to a sketch artist even, if one had ever asked her, which nobody ever had, but his shape. His build. The particular way he held his shoulders, high and tight, like a man perpetually braced for a blow he'd learned to give before receiving. Wade Garrity. She hadn't known the name then. Wouldn't learn it for years. Wouldn't piece together the whole terrible architecture of who he was, and what he built out of the ashes of that night until much, much later, after she'd left home, after Amos Whitlock had found her half-starved and furious in a mining camp 2 territories over and made her an offer that changed the whole shape of her life. I can't bring your father back, he told her. But I can teach you not to be afraid of the men who took him. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. 5 years. 5 years of learning things a young woman was never supposed to need to know. The weight of a Colt single-action army in a hand still growing into itself. The particular discipline of breathing before a trigger pull. The patience required to track a man for 3 days across bad country, and the colder patience required to wait, once you'd found him, for the moment, when justice and opportunity lined up into the same narrow window. She'd earned a name in those years. Earned it the way you earn anything out on the frontier, through repetition, through survival, through the slow accumulation of stories that grow larger every time they're told by someone who wasn't there. The Widowmaker. She used to hate the name. Used to think it made her sound like something out of a dime novel, some invented creature stitched together from other men's fear. But it stuck to her anyway, the way names do, and by the time she was 23 there were wanted men in 4 territories who'd changed their travel plans rather than risk crossing paths with the woman that name belonged to. Wade Garrity's gang had lost members to her. 3 of them, over 3 separate years, each one a debt paid slowly against an account that could never actually be balanced, because the one payment that mattered, her father's life, was the one payment nobody could ever collect. Garrity himself had always stayed just out of reach. Always one town ahead, one tip too late, one river crossing too far. She'd come close twice. Close enough to smell the campfire smoke of a camp he'd abandoned hours before. Close enough, once, to see him from a ridge half a mile off, and understand, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence, that she was looking at the man who killed her father. She never caught him. And then, in her 25th year, in a town she'd only stopped in for supplies, she met a quiet man named Daniel Calloway, who sold feed and grain and had the kind of steady, unhurried kindness that felt, to a woman who had spent 5 years hunting other human beings across half a continent, like something close to a miracle. She put the guns away. Told herself it was for good. Told herself the hunt was over, that Garrity was somebody else's problem now, that she had earned, after everything, after all of it, the right to simply be a person instead of a weapon, with a woman's name attached to it. For 3 years that had been true. Until this morning. Josie put the revolver back together, with hands that had stopped shaking sometime in the last hour, though she couldn't have said exactly when. She set it on the table, fully assembled now, fully loaded, and looked at it for a long time in the lamplight. Then she looked toward the window. Toward the dark shape of the barn against a darker sky. Toward the east field, where Daniel had died a year ago under circumstances the sheriff's report called an accident, and something colder and more careful in the back of her mind had never quite let her believe. Ask whether the husband was really dead, the sheriff had said. Or whether that was just a story you told to keep men off your land. Why would a stranger ask that? Why would anyone care whether Daniel Calloway was truly gone, unless they already suspected, or already knew, something about the manner of his going? She sat with that question until the lamp burned low, and the first gray edge of morning found its way through the kitchen window, and by the time the sun came fully up over the ridge, Josephine Calloway had made a decision that would put an end, once and for all, to 3 years of careful, deliberate, exhausting pretending. She was done hiding what she was. Amos Whitlock arrived a little before noon, exactly as he did most days that weren't Sunday, riding his old gray mare at the unhurried pace of a man who had learned, the hard way, that hurrying rarely improved anything. He found Josie on the porch, not working, not mending, just sitting, the revolver resting openly on the small table beside her chair instead of hidden away in a drawer. He looked at the gun. Looked at her face. Understood, in the particular wordless way, that 2 people who'd known each other a long time could sometimes understand things, that something had shifted. Heard talk in town, he said, easing himself down onto the step. I imagine you did. They're saying you drew on 3 men, and didn't miss. I only drew on one of them. That's not how the story's telling it. Stories rarely stick to what happened. She looked out at the wheat. You knew this would come out eventually, didn't you? That's why you kept bringing me flour, and pretending you didn't notice the calluses on my hands weren't from milk and cows. Amos was quiet a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something lower. Something careful. Your daddy asked me for one thing, before he died, he said. Asked me to look after you. Didn't specify how. So I decided, best way to look after a girl like you was to make sure the world never got the chance to catch you unprepared again. You could have told me they might come. Garrity's men. I didn't know they would. He met her eyes. Not for certain. Suspected. Same as I've suspected a lot of things about Daniel's accident, that I never had proof enough to say out loud. The wind stopped, right then, the way it sometimes does out on the plains. One of those strange, total pauses where the whole landscape seems to be holding its breath along with you. Say it now, Josie said. Quiet. Steady. Whatever you've been not saying for a year. Say it now. Amos looked down at his hands. Old hands. Scarred hands. Hands that had, once, a long time ago, held a rifle steady beside her father's on a ridge much like this one. I don't think that plow blade found your husband by accident, he said. I think somebody put it there for him to find. The words landed the way certain words do, not loud, not sudden, but with a weight that seemed to settle into the ground itself, into the porch boards, into the wheat still, and silent beyond the fence. Josie didn't ask him to explain. Didn't need to. Some part of her had known this, had suspected it in the smallest, coldest hours of 100 sleepless nights, long before Amos ever said it out loud. Why, she said? Not a question, exactly. More like a demand aimed at the whole shape of the universe. Why would anyone want Daniel dead? He never hurt a soul in his life. That, Amos said, is the part one don't have an answer for. Not yet. But you think it's connected? To this morning? To those men? I think, he said carefully, that a stranger is skin around town whether your husband's really dead, the same week 3 of Garrity's people show up talking about buying your land. I think that's not a coincidence a man my age has the luxury of believing in. Josie sat very still. Behind her ribs, something that had been sleeping for 3 long years opened its eyes. Garrity's men, she repeated. You're certain? I recognize something in the description going around town, Amos said. Young rider. Quiet. The one whose hand you shot. Rode with Garrity's outfit back, when your daddy was chasing M, through the territory, still a boy back then, barely more than a boy now. Man goes by Coyle. The name landed somewhere deep and old inside her. A splinter she'd thought long since worked its way out, still there, still sharp, still capable of drawing blood at the smallest pressure. He's here, she said. In my territory. 15 years later. And Daniel's dead, and a stranger's been asking questions about whether I'm really alone out here, and the sheriff, she stopped herself. Started again. The sheriff knew more than he told me. I'd guess he did. Josie stood. Walked to the edge of the porch. Looked out at land she had built, board by board, season by season, into something that was supposed to be a refuge, from exactly this. From men with guns, and old grudges, and business that followed you no matter how far, or how carefully you ran from it. I promised myself I was done, she said, half to Amos, half to the wind, half to the ghost of a father, who had never once, in his whole life, taught her how to walk away from a fight that mattered. I promised myself the Widowmaker died the day I married Daniel. Maybe she did. Then what is this? She held up her hand, steady now, perfectly steady, in a way it hadn't been the night before. What is this, Amos, if not her waking back up? Amos rose slowly from the step. Stood beside her, the two of them looking out at the same gray-gold horizon that had watched over 3 generations of hard, careful, dangerous people trying to build something decent out of country that didn't much care whether they succeeded. Maybe, he said, she never really died. Maybe she just went quiet a while. Waiting for a reason worth waking up for. 3 days passed. 3 days of ordinary work performed, with a mind that had stopped being ordinary at all. Josie milked and mended, and hauled water same, as always, but underneath the routine something had shifted into a different gear entirely. A watchfulness. A readiness. A constant low hum of calculation that never fully switched off. She cleaned the revolver every night now. not hiding it in the apron pocket anymore, but keeping it on her hip, openly, the way she used to wear a gun, before she decided guns weren't a thing farm widows were supposed to wear. The town noticed. Word had already spread about the shooting, 3 different versions of it, each more dramatic than the last, and by the end of the week there was a 4th version circulating, that had her taking down all 3 riders single-handed, which wasn't true, but which she found herself not particularly inclined to correct. Let them wonder. Let them talk. Because somewhere out past the ridge, in whatever camp, or hideout or rented room Wade Garrity was using these days, word of a farm widow, with a dead-eyed draw, and a face that matched a bounty poster 15 years out of date was making its own slow, inevitable journey. 20 miles north, in a canyon, whose name appeared on no official map, Wade Garrity sat by a fire and listened to a young man named Coyle explain, with considerable embarrassment, how a widow on a farm had shot the gun clean out of his hand, before he properly understood what was happening. Garrity was older now. Grayer. A scar along his jaw that hadn't been there 15 years ago, souvenir of a life spent one step ahead of consequences, that eventually, inevitably, catch up to every man who runs from them long enough. Describe her again, he said. Quiet. Very quiet. Coyle did. The dark hair. The gray eyes. The stance, feet planted wide, weight balanced, the particular economy of motion, that separated a person who'd merely held a gun from a person who'd been raised on one. Garrity's hand resting on his knee, went very still. Calloway, he said, half to himself, testing the name the way you test ice on a pond, before trusting your full weight to it. Married name. What was it before? Nobody around the fire had an answer for that. But Garrity had a feeling. An old, cold, familiar feeling, the kind that had kept him alive across 15 years of running, from a ghost he'd assumed, or at least hoped, had finally stopped chasing him. He looked into the fire for a long time. There was a marshal, he said finally, a long time back. Had a daughter. Girl couldn't have been more than 12, 13, last time any of us laid eyes on her. He paused. Heard rumors, some years after, about a bounty woman working the territories. Dark hair. Dead-eyed draw. Never confirmed it, never had reason to look too close. You think it's her, Coyle said? Not quite a question. Garrity didn't answer right away. Somewhere out beyond the canyon walls, the wind moved through country that held, in its quiet way, 15 years of unfinished business. An old debt. An old grave. An old promise nobody living had ever heard spoken aloud, but that had shaped, without either of them fully realizing it, every choice both Wade Garrity and Josephine Calloway had made, since the night everything changed. Find out, Garrity said at last. Find out everything. Who she married. When he died. How he died. He threw the last of his coffee into the fire, watched it hiss against the coals. And find out real careful whether that farm of hers happens to sit on ground I've been looking for a long, long time. Back at the farmhouse, on the 4th night, Josie sat once more at her kitchen table, with the lamp burning low, and this time she wasn't cleaning the revolver. This time she'd taken down an old cigar box, from the top shelf of the wardrobe. A box she hadn't opened in 3 years, not since the day she married Daniel, and told herself, with the particular fierce sincerity of someone trying very hard to believe their own lie, that she wouldn't need what was inside it ever again. She opened it now. Inside. A badge that wasn't hers, but had been her father's, tarnished with age, but still recognizable. A folded wanted poster, edges gone soft, with handling, bearing a crude sketch that bore only a passing resemblance to the man it was meant to depict. Wade Garrity. Wanted for murder, $500, dead or alive. And beneath that, a photograph. Small. Faded. A young girl standing beside a tall man, with a badge on his vest, and a rifle in his hand, both of them squinting into a sun that had set 15 years ago, and never quite risen again in the same way. Josie held the photograph a long time. I kept my promise, as long as I could, she said, quiet, to the empty kitchen, to the ghost of a father who'd never gotten to see the woman she became, after he was taken from her. But I think it's about to ask something else of me now. Outside, the wind picked up again. Moved through the wheat. Moved through the dark, empty fields that held, somewhere beneath their quiet surface, a secret Josie didn't yet know she was standing on top of. A secret that Wade Garrity wanted badly enough to have already cost her one husband, and was about to cost a great many other men their lives, before this was finished. She closed the cigar box. Set the badge on the table beside the revolver. And for the first time in 3 years, Josephine Calloway went to bed not as a widow hiding from her past, but as a woman getting ready to meet it. The poster showed up on a Tuesday. Nailed to the post outside Pemberton's Mercantile. Curling at one corner, where the wind kept working at it. Old paper. Older ink. A crude sketch of a woman's face, that could have been anybody's face, except it wasn't anybody's. It was hers. Wanted. The Widowmaker. Dead or alive. $2,000. 15 years old, that poster. 15 years. And somebody had carried it all this way, folded up tight in a saddlebag, waiting for the right moment to pull it out, and nail it to a post, where the whole town would walk past it on their way to buy flour, and thread and gossip. Because that's what this was. Not evidence. Not proof. Bait. Josie stood across the street, and looked at it for a long time, before she made herself walk over. Made herself stand close enough to read the small print at the bottom. Made herself absorb every word like a blow she'd already decided not to flinch from. Behind her, whispers. Building. The way fire builds, slow at first, then all at once. That's her. Can't be. Look at the eyes. Tell me that ain't her eyes. She didn't turn around. Didn't give them the satisfaction of watching her face do something interesting. She just stood there, spine straight, hands loose at her sides, and let the town look its fill. Because they were going to look either way. Might as well let them look at a woman who wasn't ashamed. Silas Pemberton came out, from behind his counter, wiping his hands on his apron, face doing that particular dance old men's faces do, when they're trying to decide whether to be afraid or amazed. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Careful. Like her name itself might be a different kind of trap now. This yours? It's an old poster. Didn't ask how old. Asked if it's yours? Josie turned. Met his eyes. Something in her chest, something that had spent 3 years learning to apologize for taking up space, finally, quietly, refused. It's mine, she said. It's old. It's also true. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Thick. Uncomfortable. The kind of silence that makes men reach for their hats just to have something to do with their hands. Well, Pemberton said finally. I'll be. That all you got to say? What else is there? He almost smiled. Almost. Lady saved my nephew from a rattler by 2 summers back usin' nothin' but a steady hand and a hot knife. Figure whatever she used to be, before she got here, she's been good people since. Josie hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected any of it, really. Not the kindness, not the easy acceptance, not the way half the street seemed to relax the moment one old shopkeeper decided the story didn't need to change anything. But the other half. The other half was already halfway to the sheriff's office. Because fear doesn't care about rattlesnakes and hot knives. Fear cares about itself. And a woman who could shoot a gun out of a man's hand from 20 feet, a woman with a bounty on an old poster, and a story nobody in town had ever bothered asking her to explain, that woman made for very good fear indeed. Sheriff Boyd Hutchins was waiting for her, before she even reached his office. Standing in the doorway. Arms crossed. Face doing a poor job of hiding something underneath it. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, less like suspicion and more like relief. Which was strange. Which she filed away. Because everything about this man had started to feel like a puzzle, with pieces missing on purpose. Figured you'd come find me, he said. Before I had to come find you. You knew. Not a question. A statement. Flat. Final. Knew what? Don't. She stepped closer. Don't do that. Not today. Hutchins looked at her a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Some old tiredness. Some weight he'd apparently been carrying longer than she'd realized. I knew there was a woman called the Widowmaker work in the territories some years back, he said. Knew she'd gone quiet. Didn't know she'd gone quiet here. Didn't put it together till that poster showed up this morning, same as everybody else. Same as everybody else. She let the words sit. Weighed them. That why you're standing in your doorway looking like a man waiting on a confession he already half knows the shape of? Hutchins didn't answer right away. Which was its own kind of answer. Come inside, he said finally. Both of us are gonna want privacy for the rest of this conversation. Inside, the office smelled like old coffee, and gun oil, and the particular mustiness of a building that saw more paperwork than people. Hutchins closed the door. Latched it. Sat down behind his desk like a man settling into a weight he'd rather not carry, but had run out of ways to set down. Sit, he said. I'll stand. Suit yourself. Silence. The kind that asks a question, without saying it out loud. Somebody's been paying me, Hutchins said finally. Little while now. Not to look the other way on anything big. Just small things. Slow things. The kind of things a man tells himself don't matter till he wakes up one morning, and realizes he's in too deep to climb back out. Josie's hand found the edge of the desk. Gripped it. What things? Land surveys. Ownership filings. Who's paying taxes on what plot, who's behind on what payment. He wouldn't meet her eyes now. Man who's been paying me never gave a name. Just money, left at the same drop point every month, and a note telling me what to look up next. And you never asked who? I asked myself that plenty. His jaw tightened. Man convinces himself the money's harmless long enough, he stops to skin the harder questions. Told myself it wasn't hurting anybody. Told myself a lot of things. Josie felt something cold uncoil in her stomach. Was my name on that list, she said. Quiet. Ever. At any point. Was I one of the things you lipped up? Hutchins was quiet for a long, long time. Your husband was, he said finally. The room went very still. Say that again, Josie said. Because she needed to hear it twice. Because the first time hadn't finished landing yet. Somebody paid me, a year back, maybe a little more, to find out everything about Daniel Calloway. Where he came from. What he did before he got here. Whether he had family looking for him. Whether, Hutchins stopped. Swallowed. Whether he had any connection to a marshal used to work these territories. Man named Marsh. The name hit her like ice water. My father's name, she said. I didn't know that then. Didn't put it together till just now, saying it out loud to you. He shook his head. Slow. Disgusted, maybe, with himself. I found out Daniel wasn't connected to any marshal. Found out he was exactly what he looked like. A feed and grain man, with a quiet life, and no secrets worth paying for. Sent that report off same as any other. And then he died. And then he died. Hutchins's voice had gone rough. 3 weeks after I sent that report. Plow accident, everybody said. I wrote it up that way myself. Never thought twice. Think twice now. He looked at her. Really looked. And something in his face, some last wall he'd been holding up, finally came down. I think, he said, somebody wanted to know if your husband was a threat before they decided whether he needed to stop being alive. And I think I'm the man who handed them the answer that got him killed. Josie didn't remember leaving the sheriff's office. Didn't remember crossing the street, didn't remember the ride home, didn't remember much of anything, until she was standing in her own kitchen, with both hands flat on the table, breathing like she'd run the whole distance instead of ridden it. Because grief, she'd learned, doesn't come in one shape. It comes in whatever shape fits through the door you've left open. And the door she'd left open today wasn't grief for a man already buried. It was rage. Slow. Building. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that goes quiet instead, quiet and cold, and patient, because patient rage is the only kind that ever actually finishes what it starts. Daniel hadn't died because a horse spooked. Daniel hadn't died because of bad luck or a loose blade, or any of the small tragic accidents that happen to ordinary men living ordinary lives on hard, unforgiving land. Daniel had died because somebody wanted to know if he was dangerous. And somebody had decided he wasn't. Which meant somebody had decided, in that same breath, that his life wasn't worth protecting. Which meant somebody had killed him. Coldly. Deliberately. Not out of anger. Out of arithmetic. Josie sat down at the table. Put her face in her hands. And for the first time since the funeral, for the first time in an entire year of careful, controlled, dry-eyed mourning, she wept. Not quietly. Not politely. The whole ugly shape of it, shoulders shaking, breath ragged, a year of held-back grief finally finding the door somebody else had accidentally left open. She let herself have exactly 10 minutes of it. Then she wiped her face, stood up straight, and went to the wardrobe, where the cigar box waited, badge and photograph, an old wanted poster all still sitting exactly where she'd left them 4 nights ago. "All right," she said out loud, to the empty kitchen, to her father's photograph, to the whole silent and unforgiving sky outside her window. "All right. You want to know what I am? Fine. I'll show you." Amos arrived the next morning to find her already saddling the horse. "Where you headed?" "Canyon country. North of the ridge. That's Garrity Range." "I'm aware." He stepped in front of the horse. Not blocking her, exactly. Just standing there, the way an old man stands, when he's decided a thing needs saying even if it isn't going to change anything. "You go riding up there half-cocked," he said. "You're not hunting Garrity anymore. You're just handing him what he already wants. A body to bury instead of a debt to answer for. He killed Daniel. You don't know that for certain. I know enough." "Knowing enough and knowing for certain," Amos said, "is the exact gap men die in, out here. Your daddy taught you better than that." "I know he did, 'cause I was standing right beside him when he taught it." Josie's hands went still on the saddle strap. "Because he was right. Because some old, disciplined part of her, the part that had survived 5 years of bounty hunting by never once letting grief make her decisions for her, knew he was right even as every other part of her wanted to ignore it completely." "So what do you suggest?" she said. "I just wait. Let him come to me instead." "I suggest," Amos said, "we find out exactly what he's after." "Why now? Why this land?" "'Cause a man like Garrity don't risk showing his hand in territory he knows is dangerous to him, unless there's something underneath it worth the risk." They found it 3 days later. Not through violence. Through patience, the older, quieter weapon, the one that had kept Amos Whitlock alive, through decades that had killed far younger, far faster men. It came from a land office clerk in the next county over, a nervous young man named Fitch, who owed Amos a favor going back further than anybody cared to explain, and who was more than willing to pull old survey filings, if it meant settling that debt for good. "There it is," Fitch said, spreading a map across the counter, finger tracing a line that ran straight through the northern edge of Josie's property. "Original territorial survey. Done back in '68, before the land got parceled out proper." "What am I looking at?" Josie asked. "Old mining claim. Predates your husband's ownership. Predates most everything out here." Fitch's finger stopped on a small marked square, tucked into the corner of her land nearest the ridge. "Silver strike. Filed, worked for about 6 months, then abandoned when the vein ran thin. Or when everybody thought it did. Thought it did. Assay reports from back then were sloppy. Half the claims out this territory got abandoned on bad readings. Man who actually understood rock, real understanding, not guesswork, could have looked at that same vein and seen it wasn't thin at all. Just deep. Josie stared at the map. At the small marked square sitting on her land like a secret, that had been waiting, patiently, for 15 years to be found. Garrity knows this, she said. Somebody told him. Or he found out some other way. Either way, Fitch tapped the square, there's a fortune sittin' under your north field, Mrs. Calloway. And there's a man willin' to kill for it, who already tried once. The pieces clicked together, with a violence that felt almost physical. Daniel's death. Not personal. Not revenge, not old business between her father and Garrity finally coming due. Just money. Just a silver vein nobody had bothered to properly assess 15 years ago, sitting quiet under her land the whole time she'd been living her small, careful, ordinary life on top of it. Which meant her father's murder and Daniel's murder weren't even the same story. Except they were connected anyway, weren't they? Because if Garrity hadn't already had men in this territory, men left over, from the gang, that had killed her father, men who still rode under his name, and answered to his orders, he never would have had the reach to find this claim, to investigate Daniel, to set this whole terrible machine in motion in the first place. Two separate griefs. One shared root. She sat with that for a long time. He's not comin' back for you, Amos said quietly, watching her face work through it. Not personally. Not for revenge, not for old business. No. He's comin' back for the land. Yes. Which means, Amos said, he don't much care whether you're the Widowmaker or not. Long as you're standin' between him and what's under your north field, you're just an obstacle. Josie looked up. Something in her eyes had changed, the grief still there, still raw, but sitting now beside something colder, something more useful. Then let's make sure, she said, that being an obstacle costs him more than he's willing to pay. Coyle came back alone. No backup. No big talking partner, with yellow teeth, and a chip on his shoulder about being upstaged by a farm widow. Just Coyle, riding in slow at dusk, his gun hand still wrapped in a dirty bandage, from the visit weeks ago, sitting his horse at the edge of the yard like a man who'd rehearsed what he was about to say, and still wasn't fully confident in it. Josie stepped out onto the porch. Rifle in hand this time. Not hidden. Not apologized for. You've got nerve, she said, coming back here. Wasn't my idea. Whose was it? Boss wants to talk. Face to face. Says there's things you don't understand about this situation. Says, Coyle hesitated. Says it concerns your father. Something in Josie's chest went very still. My father's been dead 15 years. I know. Coyle's voice had dropped. Lost some of its swagger. I was there. That night. Wasn't more than a boy myself, riding with men twice my age, who didn't ask my opinion about anything. Followed orders. Watched a man die, who never did anything to deserve it. Been carrying that a long time. Josie's grip tightened on the rifle. You expect sympathy? No, ma'am. Expect nothing from you at all. He looked down at his bandaged hand. But I got a brother. Had a brother, I should say. Rode with a different outfit few years back, tryin' to make his own name instead of livin' in Garrity's shadow. Ran into a bounty woman out past the Sweetwater country. Never made it home. The wind stopped. That was you, Coyle said. Quiet. Almost gentle, in a way, that felt more dangerous than any threat he could have made. Wasn't it? 5 years back. Man named Ezra Coyle. My brother. Josie's mind went back, fast, unwilling, dragged there by a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 5 years. A camp along the Sweetwater. A man who'd drawn on her first, who she'd had no choice but to answer, who died with a look of pure astonishment on his face, because he'd never once believed a woman could outdraw him. He drew first, she said. I know. Coyle's jaw worked. Don't make the miss in him any smaller. Here was the thing Josie hadn't expected. Hadn't planned for. Hadn't built any careful defense against, because grief, real grief, the kind that lives in another person's chest, and has nothing at all to do with you, doesn't announce itself in advance. She hadn't planned on feeling anything for the man sitting his horse at the edge of her yard. But she did. Because somewhere underneath the bandaged hand, and the borrowed swagger of Garrity's outfit, there was a boy who'd watched his brother die, and never gotten to say goodbye, and Josie knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what that particular grief did to a person over enough years. "I'm not gonna apologize," she said, "for defending myself against a man who drew first. Didn't ask you to." "Then what are you asking?" Coyle was quiet a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rawer. "I'm asking you to understand," he said, "why I might not fight as hard for Garrity's cause as he thinks I will. 'Cause I've spent 5 years hating the woman who killed my brother. And now I'm sitting here looking at her, and all I can think is," he stopped. Shook his head. "All I can think is, my brother drew first. Same as your daddy's killers never gave him the chance to draw at all." He left without another word. Rode back up the north road same as he'd come, and Josie stood on the porch a long time, after he'd disappeared, over the ridge, rifle still in hand, heart doing something complicated she didn't have a clean name for. "That was strange," Amos said, coming around from the barn, where he'd been watching, rifle of his own kept low, and ready the whole conversation. "Strange doesn't cover it. You think he's telling the truth? About his brother? About not wanting to fight so hard?" "I think," Josie said slowly, "that grief makes people do all kinds of things nobody expects. Including a man who's supposed to hate you deciding he can't quite manage it the way he wants to. Dangerous thing to count on." "I'm not counting on it." She looked north, toward the ridge, toward whatever camp Wade Garrity was sitting in right now, planning his next move against a woman he'd apparently decided was both a threat and an opportunity in the same terrible breath. "I'm just saying. Not every man riding with Garrity wants to be there. Might be worth remembering that, before this is over." The ambush came 4 days later. Not at the farmhouse. On the road, the long stretch between Coldwater Ridge and the county seat, where Josie and Amos had ridden out together to file a formal claim on the silver vein, before Garrity's people could find some crooked way to steal the paperwork out from under her. They should have expected it. Should have read the signs: too much quiet, too few birds, the particular hell-breath stillness that experienced riders learn to fear more than any loud noise. But grief and rage make a person slower than they should be, even a person as disciplined as Josephine Calloway, and by the time the first shot cracked out from the rocks above the trail, they were already inside the kill zone. "Down!" Amos shouted, and Josie was already moving, already off the horse, and pressed flat against a boulder, before the second shot even landed, dust kicking up inches from where her head had been a half-second before. "How many?" she called. 4, maybe 5. Up on the rise." Her mind sorted the sound the way it used to sort everything, back in the years she'd spent learning to survive exactly this kind of moment. Rifle fire, not pistol. Sharps, most likely, judging by the deep crack of it. Which meant range. Which meant whoever was up there had picked this spot deliberately, had known exactly where the road narrowed into a bottleneck, with no good cover on either side. Which meant this wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. "They knew we were coming," she shouted over the gunfire. "Only people who knew," Amos shouted back, firing a return shot toward the rise, "was you, me, and whoever's at the land office holding our filing paperwork." The realization landed even as another shot chewed splinters off the rock beside her face. Fitch. Or someone close to Fitch. Someone who'd known their route, their timing, their whole careful plan, and had sold that knowledge to the one man in the territory, with enough money and enough motive to want them stopped, before that paperwork ever reached the county seat. The fight that followed was ugly. Ragged. Nothing like the clean, controlled encounters Josie had trained for in her bounty hunting years, where distance and preparation gave her every advantage. This was close, chaotic, 5 against 2, with bad ground, and worse odds, and for the first time in a long time she felt something she hadn't felt since the night her father died. Fear. Real fear. Not the manageable kind, not the kind that sharpens focus and steadies hands. The other kind. The kind that whispers, underneath everything, that this might actually be the day it all ends. Amos! His return shout came half a second late. Which was wrong? Which was its own kind of alarm, because Amos Whitlock had never once been half a second late to anything in the 15 years she'd known him. She looked. Saw him slumped against the rock, hand pressed to his side, blood already dark, and spreading between his fingers. "I'm all right," he managed. "Winged me." "Nothing worse." It was worse. She could see that it was worse even, from 10 feet away, even through the dust, and the smoke, and the ringing chaos of gunfire, that hadn't let up for even a second. Something in her broke open then. Not into panic. Into something colder. Something that had a name she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. What happened next, she would later struggle to fully explain, even to herself, even in the small hours, when she replayed it, over and over looking for the exact moment her mind had made the switch. There wasn't a single moment. There was just a threshold, crossed without ceremony, between the woman who'd spent 3 years pretending to be ordinary, and the one who'd spent 5 years being anything but. She came up, from behind the rock at an angle nobody up on the rise expected. Low, fast, using the terrain the way her father had taught her to use it, not as an obstacle, but as a partner, something that could hide her, guide her, buy her the half-second advantage that made the difference between living and not. The first man she hit wasn't even aiming at her, when the shot took him. Center mass, clean, and he went down, without a sound. The second one turned, too slow, already understanding in some animal way, that the situation had inverted itself, that the hunters had become, in the space of a few seconds, the hunted. "She's flankin'," he shouted, and it was the last full sentence he ever spoke, because Josie's second shot found him, before the sentence finished leaving his mouth. 3 left. She heard them scrambling now, heard the particular sound of men who'd planned an ambush against easy prey, and discovered, far too late, that the prey had teeth of its own. One of them broke, and ran for the horses. She let him go. Wasn't interested in killing men who'd already decided the fight wasn't worth their lives. The other 2 didn't run fast enough. When it was over, when the last echo of gunfire had rolled away across the empty country, and the only sound left was Amos's ragged breathing, and her own heart slamming against her ribs, Josie stood in the settling dust, and looked at what she'd done. 2 men dead. 1 fled. Amos bleeding against a rock, gray-faced, breathing wrong. And underneath all of it, quiet, terrible, unmistakable, the knowledge that she hadn't hesitated. Not once. Not for a fraction of a second. The part of her she'd spent 3 years trying to bury had come roaring back the instant it was needed, fully formed, fully capable, like it had never really gone anywhere at all. Like it had just been waiting. Amos. She was at his side, before she'd even decided to move. Hands pressed against the wound, applying pressure the way she'd been taught a lifetime ago, in another life, by people who understood that the frontier didn't care how gently you wanted to live in it. "Stay with me. Don't you dare stop talking to me." "Ain't going anywhere," he managed, though his voice had gone thin, and far away in a way that frightened her more than the gunfire had. "Just need a minute." "You don't get a minute. We need to move. Josie. Don't. Josie." His hand found her wrist. Weak, but insistent. "Look at me." She looked. Saw something in his face, some old, hard-won clarity, the kind that comes to people sometimes in the middle of the worst moments of their lives. "Whatever just happened out here," he said. "Whatever you just did. Don't you go apologizing for it. Don't you dare. That's what kept us both breathing." She got him back to town by nightfall. Doc's office, a flurry of activity, a bullet extracted from a wound that had bled far more than it should have, but hadn't, thank whatever mercy still watched over this hard country, hit anything a man couldn't live without. She sat outside the doctor's door for 3 hours. Didn't move. Didn't eat. Just sat, hands still faintly stained despite the washing, and stared at a wall, while her mind replayed the ambush, over and over, looking for the lesson in it, looking for the things she was supposed to learn. Sheriff Hutchins found her there a little before midnight. "Heard what happened," he said, easing himself down onto the bench beside her. "Heard it from 3 different men, all of them swearing different things happened, which tells me it must be at least partly true. 2 men are dead." "I know. I killed them, Sheriff. Not in self-defense in some clean, arguable way. I flanked them. Hunted them. Same as I used to hunt men for money, years ago, in a life I told myself was finished." Hutchins was quiet a moment. "You know what I think," he said finally. "What?" "I think a woman defended herself, and a wounded friend against 5 men, who ambushed her on an open road for no reason except greed, and somebody else's orders." He looked at her. "I think the law in this territory has bigger problems than parsin' the difference between defense and huntin', when the people doin' the huntin' set the ambush in the first place. That's generous of you." "Ain't generosity." His voice had gone rough. "It's guilt. I told you already? I'm the reason somebody knew enough about your husband to decide he needed killin'. I ain't about to compound that by pretendin' I don't understand exactly why you did what you did today." Doc came out a little, after midnight, wiping his hands, face tired but not grim, which Josie had learned by now was the best kind of tired a doctor's face could show. "He'll live," Doc said. "Lost blood he didn't have much extra of, at his age. But he'll live. Ought to keep him off a horse a few weeks, mind, though I doubt he'll listen." "He won't," Josie said, and something in her chest loosened, just slightly, just enough to let her breathe fully for the first time in hours. She sat with Amos a while after that. He was pale, weak, propped up on pillows, that made him look older than she'd ever let herself see him, but his eyes were clear, and his voice, when he finally spoke, hadn't lost its particular dry edge. "You did good out there," he said. "I did terrible things out there." "Terrible things done for the right reasons," Amos said, "ain't the same as terrible things done for no reason at all. Your daddy taught you that difference. I watched him teach it to you, right here in this territory, more years ago than either of us likes countin'. Doesn't feel different right now. It will." He closed his eyes, exhaustion finally winning out over conversation. "Give it time." "And Josie?" "Yeah. Next time somebody comes at you, with 5 men, and a bottleneck," he murmured, already half asleep, "maybe pick the fight on ground you chose instead of ground they did." She rode back to the farm alone, that night, under a sky gone thick, with stars, the kind of vast and indifferent beauty that had always made her feel, in better years, like the world was larger and kinder than the small, violent corner of it she'd been born into. Tonight it just felt large. Because somewhere out past the ridge, Wade Garrity was hearing reports right now about 2 dead men and a failed ambush, and he was drawing his own conclusions, making his own calculations, understanding, the same way she was understanding it, from the opposite side of an old and terrible debt, that this was no longer a matter that could be settled with intimidation and stolen paperwork. This was going to end the only way these things ever ended, out here, in country that had never once pretended to be gentle. She thought about Coyle. About the strange, unwanted sympathy that had passed between them on her porch days ago. About whether that sympathy would matter at all, when the final reckoning came, or whether blood and old orders would win out the way they usually did. She thought about her father. About the badge in the cigar box, tarnished but still whole. About the particular weight of carrying his name into a fight he'd started and never gotten to finish. And she thought, most of all, about Daniel, quiet, steady, undeserving Daniel, who'd asked for nothing except a simple life on land that turned out to be sitting on top of a fortune he'd never even known was there, and who'd paid for a discovery he never made, with the only thing he had left to give. "I'm going to finish this," she said out loud, to the stars, to the empty road, to whatever was listening in a country that had taken so much from her and given back so little. "Whatever it costs. I'm going to finish what he started." The wind changed 3 days after the ambush. Not gentler. Not kinder. Just different, colder at the edges, carrying with it the particular metallic smell that old-timers in this territory call the blood wind, though nobody could ever quite explain why, except that it always seemed to blow through right before something terrible finished what it started. Josie stood at her kitchen window and watched it move through the wheat and did not believe in omens. Except she did a little. Except everybody out here did, whether they admitted it or not, because you didn't survive long on land this hard, without learning to read the small signs the world left lying around for those willing to notice them. The farm was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. The kind of quiet that comes right before a hell breath gets let out all at once. Amos had been back 3 days. Insisted on it, over Doc's objections, over Josie's objections, over what amounted to nearly everyone in Coldwater Ridge telling him a man his age, with a bullet wound not yet a week old, had no business riding a horse home to a farm that might be attacked again at any hour. He'd come anyway. Sat now on the porch step, with a blanket over his knees that he clearly resented, and a rifle across his lap that he clearly did not, watching the tree line, with the patient, unblinking attention of a man who had spent most of his life learning that patience was the only defense that never ran out of ammunition. "You shouldn't be out here," Josie said, bringing him coffee he hadn't asked for. "Neither should you. And yet." "That's different." "How?" "I own the place. I help raise the woman who owns it." He took the coffee. Didn't drink it right away. Just held it, letting the steam curl up past the face that had gone grayer than she liked in the last week. "Figure that earns me a porch step." She sat down beside him. Let the silence hold for a while, the way silence does between two people who don't need to fill every gap with talking. "Hutchins came by yesterday," she said finally, "while you were still at Doc's. And he arrested Fitch." Amos's eyebrows went up. First real reaction she'd gotten out of him in days. The land clerk. The land clerk. Josie's jaw tightened. Confessed to the whole thing inside an hour, according to Hutchins. Garrity's men had been paying him for months. Land filings, ownership records, travel routes for anybody filing claims that mattered to their operation. "He's the one who sold our route. He's the one who sold our route." Amos was quiet a moment, processing that, turning it over the way he turned everything over before deciding what to do with it. "And Hutchins," he said. "He just walked into the land office and arrested the man. After admitting to me he'd been on Garrity's payroll himself. He turned himself in too. Filed a formal report with the Territorial Marshal's office. Everything. His own corruption, Fitch's, the whole rotten thread of it, going back 2 years. That'll end his career. He knows that. Did it anyway. Did it anyway." Amos finally drank his coffee. Looked out at the tree line a long moment, something working behind his eyes that Josie couldn't quite name. "Man makes a mistake," he said slowly, "questions never whether he made it. Questions what he does once he understands what it cost." He glanced at her. "Sounds like your sheriff finally understood." "He's not my sheriff." "Didn't say he was?" Amos almost smiled. "Said he was understanding something, is all." Hutchins rode out that afternoon. Alone. No badge on his vest, first time Josie had ever seen him without it, and something about its absence made him look smaller, older, more like an ordinary tired man than the authority he'd represented for 6 years. "I'm not sheriff anymore," he said before she could ask. "Territorial Marshal's office is sending someone to review everything I touched these past 2 years. Might be a while before they decide what happens to me. Might be prison. Might just be disgrace." He shrugged, though the shrug cost him something. "Either way. Figured you deserved to hear it from me before you heard it from somebody else's version of the story. Why'd you turn yourself in?" "Because a good man's dead," Hutchins said, "and I helped make that happen, even if I never pulled the trigger. And because," he stopped. Started again. Because I got tired of being the kind of man who tells himself small lies are different from big ones. Josie studied him a long moment. What do you know about Fitch's confession, she said. About the route. About who exactly ordered that ambush. Garrity himself. Fitch never dealt with anybody else. Hutchins's face went grim. But there's something else. Something Fitch let slip, that I think you need to hear, and I think you're not gonna like hearing it. Say it. Garrity's not planning to negotiate anymore. Not planning to send men to talk, or threaten, or make offers you can refuse. Hutchins met her eyes. Fitch says he's coming himself. Bring in every man he's got left. Says he means to take that land outright now, whatever it costs him, and he means to make sure there's nobody left standing who can file a legal claim against him once it's done. The wind moved through the yard. Cold. Metallic. The blood wind, exactly as the old-timers described it. When, Josie said? Fitch didn't know exactly. Days, maybe? Not weeks. Hutchins's voice had gone low. He's comin' for the farm, Mrs. Calloway. Not to talk. To finish it. That night, Josie didn't sleep, but this time the sleeplessness had purpose behind it instead of grief. She sat at the kitchen table, with a lamp burning, and a sheet of paper in front of her, and she made a list the way her father had taught her to make lists. Cold. Methodical. Every variable accounted for, because sentiment killed people out here, and precision kept them breathing. Positions. Sight lines. The barn's structural weaknesses. The well, the water trough, the low stone wall along the eastern fence line, that could be turned into cover with a few hours' work. The distance from the ridge to the house, and what that distance meant for a man, with a sharp's rifle looking to pick off targets, before they even knew they were targets. Amos watched her work, from his chair by the stove, blanket still over his knees, saying nothing for a long while. You're planning a defense, he said finally. I'm planning a defense. Just the two of us. Not just the two of us. She didn't look up from the paper. I'm going into town tomorrow. For what? For help. She hadn't expected the town to say yes. That was the honest truth of it, sitting in her chest like a stone she hadn't known she was carrying, until it lifted. She'd expected fear. Expected the same whispered hesitation that had followed her through the streets since that wanted poster went up. Expected, at best, polite sympathy and closed doors. What she got instead, standing in the middle of Pemberton's mercantile, with half the town crowded in to hear her out, was something else entirely. Man's already killed one of our own, Pemberton said, when she finished laying out what was coming. Even if most folks round here didn't know Daniel Calloway was murdered instead of unlucky. Man's already sent riders onto a widow's land twice, with bad intentions. I don't much care what name she used to go by. I care what kind of man's fixin' to ride into my town and burn down one of my neighbors. He's got a small army, Josie said. I won't pretend otherwise. Men could die helping me. Men die around here regular enough, said a rancher named Coburn, standing near the back, arms crossed. Might as well die for something that matters. It wasn't a large group, in the end. 6 men, beyond Amos and Hutchins. Pemberton himself, too old for a rifle line, but insisting on it anyway. Coburn and his 2 grown sons. Doc, who never fired a gun in anger in his life, but knew more about keeping a wounded man breathing than anyone else in the territory. And a quiet young man named Micah Reed who never said 3 words to Josie in his life, but showed up at the farm the next morning anyway, rifle in hand, because his older sister had once been saved from a fever by a jar of Doc's medicine, and a widow's willingness to sit up 3 nights running to nurse her through it. Small. Not nearly enough, against however many men Garrity was bringing. But not nothing. Never nothing. Coyle came back the night before the attack. Alone, again, riding in slow under a moon gone thin, and pale behind high cloud, and Josie watched him come from the porch, with a rifle across her lap, and a caution in her chest, that hadn't fully eased, since their last conversation. "You shouldn't be here," she said, when he reined up at the edge of the yard. "I know. If Garrity finds out you rode here." "I know that too." His voice had a rawness to it she hadn't heard before. "Came anyway. Figured you deserved warning, straight from somebody who's seen what's comin'. Hutchins already told me. Fitch already confessed. I know he's coming. You don't know how many." Something in his tone made her go still. "Tell me." 14 men, Coyle said. "Countin' me, though I ain't plannin' to draw against you tomorrow." 14, and Garrity himself lead in 'em, which he ain't done in years. Man usually sends others to do his dyin' for him. This time he's comin' personal. 14 against 8. The math sat cold and heavy in Josie's chest. "Why," she said. "Why come himself, after all these years of staying safe, staying hidden?" Coyle looked at her a long moment. Something complicated moved behind his eyes. "Because he's dyin'," he said finally. Doc up in the mountain camp told him 3 months back. Something in his gut, something that ain't gonna get better no matter how long he waits. Man's got maybe a year left. Maybe less. He shook his head slowly. Man who knows he's dyin' anyway don't have much reason left to be careful. Josie absorbed that in silence. Because it changed things. Not the danger was exactly the same, 14 armed men riding down on a farmhouse, with murder in mind, whatever the reason behind it. But it changed the shape of the man leading them. A dying man, with nothing left to lose, was a different kind of dangerous than a careful one hedging every bet. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Why come here at all, if you're not fighting against him?" "Because my brother drew first," Coyle said, "and you answered fair. And because I've spent 5 years hating you for it, and about 2 weeks realizing the hate never had anywhere honest to go." He looked down at his hands, still faintly scarred, from the wound she'd given him weeks ago. "I ain't gonna fight for you tomorrow. Can't. Oh, Garrity too many years, to turn my gun on him outright. But I ain't gonna fight against you either." He met her eyes. "I'll ride in, with the rest of 'em tomorrow, 'cause not showing up would get me killed just as sure as showing up might. But when the shooting starts, I mean to find myself somewhere in that fight where my bullets don't find you. That's the most I got to give." It wasn't much. It was also, Josie understood, more than she had any right to expect from a man whose brother she'd killed. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me." Coyle turned his horse. "Just live through tomorrow. That's the only thanks I want." The night before the attack, the farmhouse filled with a particular kind of quiet that Josie had felt only once before in her life, the night before her first bounty job, years ago, when Amos had sat her down and told her there was no shame in being afraid, only in letting the fear choose for her. She walked the property one last time, as dusk fell. Checked every position they'd built over the past 2 days. The low stone wall reinforced into proper cover. The barn's loft converted into a firing platform, with clear sight lines down the north road. The well covered, and the water stores moved inside, where a siege couldn't cut them off. Amos found her by the fence line, standing where she'd stood the morning the first 3 riders came, weeks and a lifetime ago now. "You thinking about your daddy?" he said. "Not a question. I'm thinking about a lot of things." "Tell me one." She was quiet a long moment. "I'm thinking," she said, "that tomorrow I might have to kill Wade Garrity. And I don't know if it's going to feel like justice, or if it's just going to feel like more of the same violence that's followed my whole family for 15 years, with no end to it, ever, no matter how many men fall." Amos considered that. "Your daddy used to say something about that," he said. "Said violence out here was like a fire in dry country. Sometimes you gotta let one burn to stop a bigger one from catchin'. Don't mean you like the burnin'. Just means sometimes there ain't a way around it. That's not much comfort. Wasn't meant to be comfort." He put a hand on her shoulder, brief, warm. "Was meant to be true. They came at first light. Not under cover of darkness, the way Josie had half expected. Garrity apparently preferred to be seen coming, preferred the theater of it. 14 riders spread across the north road in a line that stretched wide enough to swallow the whole horizon, dust rising behind them like something biblical. Josie stood in the yard, with her rifle in hand, and watched them come, and beside her Amos, and Hutchins, and Pemberton with a shotgun that looked almost comically large in his old hands, and the Coblins, and Doc keeping low near the house, with his medical bag already open, and young Micah Reed pale, but steady in the barn loft above them all. 8 against 14. The wind picked up, moved through the wheat, carried with it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of hoofbeats building towards something that couldn't be stopped now, only met. "Everybody knows their position," Josie called, voice steady despite everything underneath it. "Nobody moves till I give the signal. And nobody takes a shot they're not certain of. We don't have bullets to waste." "Understood," Amos said. "Understood," Hutchins echoed, and there was something in his voice, some hard, clean resolve, that hadn't been there a week ago. The riders slowed as they came into range. Spread wider, fanning out along the fence line, and at the center of that terrible formation rode a man Josie had never seen up close, but recognized instantly, the same way you recognize a storm cloud, before the first crack of thunder. Gray-bearded, scar along his jaw, sitting his horse, with the particular stillness of a man who had made peace, however uneasily, with the idea that today might be his last. Wade Garrity. He reined up at the edge of her land, held up a hand, and the line of riders behind him slowed, with him, stopped, waited. "Josephine Marsh," he called out. Not Calloway. The old name, the one she hadn't heard spoken aloud by anyone but herself in 15 years. "Or do you go by Calloway now? Man deserves to be remembered proper, even if he's gone." "What do you want, Garrity?" "You know what I want. Say it anyway." "The land," he said. "All of it. Signed over clean, no complications, no lawyers, no territorial marshals coming to ask questions afterward." His eyes moved over the makeshift fortifications, the armed men positioned along her fence line, and something almost like respect moved across his weathered face. "You've built yourself a proper little army here." "Wasn't expectin' that. You killed my husband." "I didn't." Something shifted in his voice. "Not personally. Never laid a hand on the man." "Your men did." "My men," Garrity agreed, "actin' on my orders. Which I understand don't mean much difference to you." He was quiet a moment. "But there's something you don't know, girl. Something about your daddy that's been sittin' in my chest 15 years like a stone I never managed to put down." Josie's grip tightened on the rifle. "Say it." "Not like this," Garrity said. "Not shouting across a fence line, with 14 guns between us. You want the truth about your father, you come out here. Face to face. Same way he'd have wanted it settled, if I know anything at all about the kind of man he was." "Don't do it," Amos said, low, urgent, beside her. "It's a trap." "Has to be. Maybe." "Josie." "He wants to talk," she said. 14 against 8, and he's asking to talk instead of ordering the attack. That's not the move of a man who thinks a trap needs setting. That's the move of a man who's been carrying something a long time and's run out of road to keep carrying it. You don't know that for certain." "No," she admitted. "I don't." She stepped forward anyway. They met in the open ground between the fence line and the riders, close enough to speak, without shouting, far enough that either side's marksmen would have a hard time getting a clean shot, without risking their own leader. Garrity dismounted. Stood facing her, hands visibly empty, guns still holstered. Up close, he looked older than she'd expected. Not just gray-bearded, but hollowed out somehow, the way sick men get hollowed, something eating him, from the inside, that no amount of hard living could fully hide. "You look like him," Garrity said quietly. "Your daddy. Same eyes. Same way of standin' like the ground belongs to you even, when it don't, not yet, not for certain. Don't talk about my father like you knew him." "I did know him." Something cracked, just slightly, in Garrity's weathered voice. Rode with his outfit once. Long before I ever became what I became. Elias Marsh pulled me out of a burnin' barn, when I was 19 years old, and got nothin' for it, but a scar, and a debt he never once asked me to repay. Josie's breath caught. Just slightly. Just enough that Garrity noticed. You didn't know that, he said. No. There's a lot you don't know. He looked away, toward the ridge, toward country that held 15 years of secrets he'd apparently decided, on the morning he expected might be his last, to finally set down. The night they killed him. I was there. You know that already, I'd wager, bein' who you are, seein' what you must have seen, from wherever you were hidin'. I saw your shape, Josie said. In the dark. I never saw your face clear. Never knew for certain it was you, until Coyle told me your description. I didn't pull the trigger, Garrity said. I want you to hear that plain, whatever else you believe about me. I begged the others not to do it. Told them a marshal dead brings down more trouble than a marshal alive, and lookin' the other way ever could. Told them there had to be another way. His hands had curled into fists at his sides, old grief finding its way back to the surface, after 15 years of being pushed down. They didn't listen. I was young. I was outnumbered. And I stood there, and watched a man who'd once pulled me out of a fire die in the dirt, and I did nothing to stop it. The confession hung in the air between them, heavier than any threat could have been. Josie's mind reeled backward, 15 years, to a loft, and a gap in the boards, and a shape she'd never fully been able to picture, as a whole man. She'd built an entire understanding of her life around that shape. Around the certainty that Wade Garrity had murdered her father in cold blood, that every choice she'd made since, every year spent hunting his gang across 4 territories, had been built on a foundation of pure and simple villainy. And now that foundation was cracking. Why are you telling me this now, she said. Her voice had gone unsteady in a way she hated. After 15 years. After all the men I've killed chasing pieces of your outfit. After everything. Because I'm dying, Garrity said simply. Doc says a year, maybe less. And a man who's dyin' finds out real quick which lies he's willin' to carry into the ground with him and which ones he ain't. He met her eyes. I ain't willin' to carry that one. Not anymore. That doesn't undo what your men did. No, he agreed. It don't. And I ain't askin' you to forgive it. I'm just askin' you to understand it for whatever happens next happens. Josie stood very still. Because here was the terrible, complicated truth of it. The truth that no bounty poster, no wanted notice, no 15 years of hard-earned hatred had prepared her for. Wade Garrity was not the simple monster she'd built him into. He was a man who had failed to stop a murder, who had lived 15 years under the weight of that failure, who was standing in front of her now not to threaten, but to confess, because death had made him honest in a way life never had. And yet he was also the man leading 14 riders onto her land to take it by force. The man whose orders had gotten Daniel killed, whatever guilt he carried about her father. The man who, guilt or no guilt, dying or not dying, had not once in 15 years done anything to change the path his outfit had walked, had simply kept riding it, kept profiting from it, kept leaving graves behind him across 4 territories. Confession did not undo consequence. Grief did not cancel out harm. You still ordered Daniel's death, she said. Whatever guilt you're carrying about my father. That's a separate debt, and it's one you haven't even tried to explain. Something in Garrity's face tightened. I did, he admitted. That one I won't dress up with excuses. Found out about the silver claim on your land, from an old survey map my man Fitch dug up. Needed to know if your husband was a threat before I made my move. Sent men to find out. His jaw worked. They came back saying he wasn't a threat. And I gave the order anyway. Told myself it was cleaner that way. No loose ends, no witness who might someday connect the land grab back to me. Cleaner. The word came out of her like poison. You killed a good man, because it was cleaner. Yes. The single word landed harder than any excuse could have. For that, Garrity said, I offer no confession that makes it smaller. I did that, knowing full well what it cost you. And I'd understand, better than any man alive, if that's the debt you mean to collect on today. The wind picked up between them. Cold. Waiting. Behind Josie, along the fence line, 8 rifles stayed trained and ready. Behind Garrity, 14 riders sat their horses in tense, uncertain silence, watching their leader stand unarmed, and exposed in open ground, none of them quite understanding what conversation was unfolding, or how it might end. What happens now, Josie said, if I refuse to sign over the land? Then my men attack, Garrity said. And a lot of people die today, who don't need to. Yours. Mine. Maybe both of us, for it's finished. He looked at her steadily. I came out here hoping there was another way. Hoping that telling you the truth about your daddy might buy enough understanding to end this, without more graves. And if there isn't another way? Then I reckon, Garrity said quietly, we settle this the old way. Same way Elias Marsh would have settled it, if the situations were reversed. One draw. Fair ground. Whoever's left standing decides what happens to the land, and to the men waiting behind us. Josie's mind raced through every possible calculation. The 14 riders, who would either stand down, or attack depending on what happened in the next few minutes. The 8 defenders behind her, who would fight, and possibly die regardless of what she chose. The silver beneath her land, that had already cost one good man his life, and threatened to cost many more, before this was finished. And underneath all of it, quieter, older, more insistent than any tactical consideration, the 15-year-old question of what justice actually looked like, now that the man who'd haunted her nightmares had turned out to be more complicated, more human, more genuinely remorseful than any villain in a dime novel had a right to be. One draw, she said finally. Fair ground. But if your men, so much as twitch toward a weapon, while we settle this, mine have orders to end this the hard way. Same goes for you. Agreed. And if I win, Josie said, your men ride away? All of them. No retaliation, no second attempt, nothing. This ends today, one way or the other. Garrity was quiet a moment, looking past her toward the fence line, toward the 8 people who'd chosen to stand, and fight for a widow they'd known only a few short weeks. Agreed, he said again. And if I win, his voice caught, just slightly. If I win, I want your word the land still goes to building something decent. School. Church. Whatever this territory needs most. Not to my men, not to whatever's left of my outfit once I'm gone. I've made enough money off other people's graves. Don't want to add yours to that pile too. The strangeness of it, a dying outlaw negotiating the terms of his own potential victory towards something like redemption, settled over Josie like a physical weight. Agreed, she said. They walked 20 paces apart. The particular ritual of it, old as the frontier itself, silent and understood by everyone present, without a single word of instruction needed. 14 riders held their positions. 8 defenders held theirs. And in the wide, empty space between 2 lines of armed and waiting people, a woman not yet 30 and a dying man old enough to have known her father stood back to back, then turned, then walked, counting silently, toward the moment that would decide everything. Josie's mind, in those 20 steps, went somewhere strange and quiet. Because this was not the ending she'd imagined, all those nights lying awake hunting Garrity's gang across 4 territories, dreaming of the moment she'd finally cornered the man who'd taken her father from her. She'd imagined rage. Imagined righteous fury, clean and simple, a debt collected without complication. What she felt instead, walking those 20 paces, was grief. Old grief and new grief, tangled together into something she didn't have a clean name for. Grief for her father. Grief for Daniel. Grief, even, in some small and unwanted corner of her heart, for the frightened 19-year-old boy Garrity must have once been, pulled from a fire by a man he'd later watched die, and been powerless to save. 20 paces. She turned. Time did the thing it always did in moments like these, fractured into pieces too small, and too fast for ordinary thought to hold. She saw Garrity's hand move. Saw the particular hesitation in it, the smallest possible fraction of a second, where a dying man, who had spent 15 years failing to stop one death seemed, for just an instant, to consider not drawing at all. He drew anyway. Because habit, in the end, is stronger than intention. Because 14 years of violence doesn't unlearn itself in a single moment of confession, however sincere. Because some part of Wade Garrity, even now, even dying, even genuinely remorseful, still believed that the only way this could end was the way it had always ended for men like him. Josie's hand moved faster. It had to. Everything she was, everything her father had built, into her over 13 short years, before his death, everything Amos had sharpened in the 5 years after, all of it converged, into a single motion, clean and final, the culmination of a lifetime spent becoming exactly what this moment required. The shot rang out across the open ground, and rolled away toward the ridge, and for a long, suspended moment nobody on either side of the fence line moved at all. Wade Garrity stood a moment longer than seemed possible. Looked down at the wound in his chest, with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, more like recognition, like a man finally meeting a debt he'd known, somewhere deep down, was always going to come due. Fair, he said, quiet, almost gentle. Fair draw. Your daddy would have been. He didn't finish the sentence. He was dead before he hit the ground. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Josie had ever heard. 14 riders sat their horses, frozen, waiting for some signal, that never came, because their leader was gone, and nobody among them had the authority, or the appetite to order what happened next. Coyle, she saw, had already lowered his rifle. Was looking at her not with hatred, not with the grief-fueled fury she might have expected, but with something that looked almost like release. It's over, Josie called out, her voice carrying clean and steady across the open ground despite everything shaking beneath it. Your leader's dead. Fair draw, fair ground, same as agreed. Ride away now, and this ends here. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Coyle turned his horse. Rode a slow half-circle back toward the ridge, and one by one, the other riders followed him, until the whole terrible line, that had come at first light simply dissolved back, into the country it had come from, leaving nothing behind, but dust and silence, and a dead man lying in the open ground between two farms, that would never quite be the same again. Josie stood over Garrity's body a long time, before she let anyone else approach. You all right? Amos asked, finally coming up beside her, rifle lowered now, his weathered face full of a concern he didn't bother trying to hide. I don't know, she said honestly. I thought I would feel something clean, when this was over. Something simple. Justice done, debt collected, that kind of clean. She looked down at the man, who had haunted 15 years of her life. I don't feel clean. I feel tired, Amos said quietly. Tired, she agreed. And sad. And I don't fully understand why I feel sad for a man who helped destroy half my family, except that I think, somewhere underneath everything he became, there really was a 19-year-old boy who tried to save my father, and failed, and spent the rest of his life not knowing what to do with that failure except let it turn him into something worse. Amos put a hand on her shoulder. That's not weakness, he said. Feelin' sad for a complicated man doing terrible things for complicated reasons. That's just seeing clear. Your daddy always said the men who scared him most weren't the simple villains. Were the ones who almost weren't. What followed unfolded slowly, the way healing always does, in small unglamorous increments, that don't make for dramatic telling, but matter more, in the end, than any single dramatic moment. Fitch's confession, combined with testimony from half the town about the ambush and the attack, painted a picture clear enough that no serious legal jeopardy ever attached itself to Josie for the killing of Wade Garrity. Self-defense, fair draw, witnessed by 14 of the dead man's own men. There wasn't a court in the territory that would have ruled otherwise. The silver claim got surveyed properly, this time by an honest assessor Amos knew, from years back, and the vein turned out to be exactly as rich as old Fitch's stolen paperwork had suggested. Rich enough to change the whole shape of Coldwater Ridge's future, if handled right. Josie handled it right. She kept enough to secure the farm's future, to make sure she'd never again be vulnerable to the kind of desperate calculation that had made her, and Daniel's quiet life, a target in the first place. The rest, the greater share, the fortune that had cost so many lives already, she signed over to the town itself, earmarked for exactly what Garrity had asked for in his final negotiated breath. A school went up first, named, over her quiet objections, for her father. Then, the following spring, the beginnings of a proper church, built on land just south of the Mercantile, where the whole town could gather, without needing to travel the long ride to the county seat. Coyle left the territory not long after. Nobody saw him ride out, nobody heard where he was headed, but word reached Coldwater Ridge some months later, second-hand and unreliable the way all frontier news eventually was, that a man matching his description had taken up honest work on a cattle ranch 2 territories west, going by a different name, trying to build something new out of the wreckage of what he'd been. Josie hoped it was true. Hoped, in the strange, complicated way grief sometimes turns, into something almost like grace, that the boy who'd lost his brother to her gun, and found, somehow, the capacity to stand beside her instead of against her, when it mattered most, had found some measure of peace on the other side of all of it. On the first anniversary of Daniel's death, the real anniversary, the one she now understood correctly, no longer clouded by the false comfort of an accidental story, Josie rode out to the small cemetery on the hill above the farm, and stood along, while between 2 graves. Her father's marker was new, moved here that spring, his remains brought at last from the distant county, where he'd fallen, resting now on land his own daughter had fought to keep, beneath a modest stone that read simply, Elias Marsh, United States Marshal. He stood when others ran. Beside it, Daniel Stone, older, weathered already by a year of hard Wyoming weather, Daniel Calloway, beloved husband, a quiet man, who asked for nothing, and gave everything. Josie knelt between them, set down flowers for each, gathered that morning, from the same wheat fields both men, in their different ways, had helped her learn to call home. I finished it, she said quietly, to both of them, to the wind moving soft and warm now through the grass, nothing like the cold, metallic blood wind that had preceded the worst of it. Whatever it cost, whatever it changed in me, I finished it. She rode home in the low gold light of late afternoon, past Amos's gray mare grazing at the fence, past the low stone wall that had once been a defense, and was now just a wall again, past the barn, where a dog, older now, gray at the muzzle, waited by the door. She still kept the revolver. Didn't hide it anymore, didn't pretend it belonged to some other woman's life entirely separate from her own. It hung now on a hook by the door, visible, acknowledged, a tool same as any other tool on a working farm, a hammer, a plow blade, a rifle for wolves, that came too close to the livestock in hard winters. She rarely wore it. Didn't need to, mostly. Coldwater Ridge had settled into something quieter and more peaceful than it had known in years, the old fear of outlaw raids fading slowly into memory the way most fears eventually do, when the thing that caused them stops coming back. But some mornings, walking the fence line at dawn, she still felt the old readiness in her hands. Still felt, underneath the calm surface of an ordinary life rebuilt from ordinary work, the coiled and patient thing her father had put there, so many years ago, still capable, still ready, should this hard and beautiful country ever again ask something terrible of her. She hoped it wouldn't. But she no longer feared what she'd do, if it did. That final evening, she stood on the porch, with a cup of coffee gone warm and unforgotten in her hand, and watched the same wind that had opened everything move once more, through the wheat, gold sliding into gray at the edge of a new day's end. The dog lay quiet at her feet. No riders on the north road. No dust cloud carrying threat inside it. Just wheat, and wind, and a woman, who had spent 15 years running, and hiding and fighting, and grieving, and had finally, at long last, stopped. She had been the Widowmaker. She had been a farm widow hiding what she was. Now she was simply Josephine Calloway, the softness and the steel both, no longer required to choose between them, standing on land that had cost her everything, and given her, in the end, exactly enough.